The dust devil that brought him to her door carried more than sand and tumbleweeds. It carried the weight of a broken man clinging to the only piece of hope he had left in this world. And when Grace Morales opened that weathered oak door to find a Navajo warrior collapsed on her trading post steps with a bundle pressed against his chest that moved and breathed and cried with the voice of new life, she knew that some storms don't just bring destruction. They bring the chance to rebuild everything you thought was lost forever. Grace Morales had learned to read the desert like other women read scripture, and on this scorching August morning, in 1885, the wind whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. The trading post sat like a lonely sentinel in the vast expanse of Arizona territory, 30 miles from the nearest settlement and 40 miles from the Navajo reservation that the government had carved out like a scar across the ancient landscape. She'd built this life deliberately, far from prying eyes and wagging tongues, where a Mexican-American woman could run her own business without men questioning her right to exist in their world.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning started like any other, with Grace checking her inventory of flour, coffee, and ammunition that kept both settlers and tribal members coming to her remote outpost. She'd inherited the trading post from her late husband Samuel, a good man who died of pneumonia 3 winters past, leaving her with a choice between returning to her family in Santa Fe as a defeated widow or staying to prove that Samuel's faith in her wasn't misplaced. She chose to stay, and the desert had tested that choice every day since. The sound that shattered the morning silence wasn't thunder or gunfire, but something more human and infinitely more desperate. A low moan carried on the wind, followed by the unmistakable cry of an infant, thin and reedy like a bird calling for its mother. Grace set down the ledger she'd been updating and moved to the front window, her hand instinctively reaching for the Henry rifle that leaned against the wall, a habit born from 3 years of living alone in country where danger wore many faces. Through the wavering heat, she saw him, a figure that seemed to materialize from the desert itself like a mirage, gaining substance. The man stumbled forward with the unsteady gait of someone who'd been walking too long under the merciless sun, his dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his clothing a mixture of traditional Navajo weaving and the rough work clothes that marked him as someone caught between two worlds. But it was what he carried that made Grace's breath catch in her throat, a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a blanket, held against his chest with the desperate care of someone protecting the last precious thing in their possession. Grace watched as the man's legs gave out 20 yards from her door, sending him to his knees in the dust with the bundle still clutched protectively against him. Even from a distance, she could see the way his shoulders shook. Whether from exhaustion or emotion, she couldn't tell, but the sound that emerged from that bundle left no doubt about what he carried. The cry of a baby, angry and alive and demanding. Attention in the way that only the very young can demand, cut through the desert air like a knife through silence. Without thinking, Grace was moving, the rifle forgotten as she burst through the door and ran toward the collapsed figure. Up close, she could see the full extent of his condition, the way his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, the dust and grime that coated his skin like a second layer of clothing, the way his hands trembled as he looked up at her, with eyes that held the kind of desperation that comes from having nowhere else to turn. But even in his extremity, his grip on the bundle never loosened, and when Grace knelt beside him in the dust, she could see the intelligence and wariness in his gaze, the look of a man who'd been hunted and knew that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Water, he managed to croak, his voice like sandpaper against dry wood. But even as he asked for help, his body shifted protectively around the bundle, and Grace realized that his own survival was secondary to whatever he carried. The bundle moved again, and a tiny fist emerged from the blanket, followed by the red, wrinkled face of an infant who couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, her dark eyes wide with the kind of alertness that spoke of intelligence beyond Her years. Grace looked from the baby to the man and saw the unmistakable resemblance in the shape of their eyes, the strong line of their chins, and knew without being told that this was his daughter. But there was something wrong with this picture, something that made her frontier-trained instincts prickle with unease. A Navajo man traveling alone with an infant, no horse, no supplies, no woman to help care for the child, was either running from something terrible or toward something desperate. And in either case, Grace knew she was about to become part of a story that was bigger than just providing water to a thirsty traveler. "Please," the man said, and the word came out as more than a request for water. It was a plea for sanctuary, for mercy, for the kind of help that couldn't be repaid with trade goods or promises. Grace saw in his eyes the same look she'd seen in her own mirror after Samuel died, the look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered and was down to their last hope, their final gamble against a world that seemed determined to grind them into dust. Grace made her decision in that moment, not because she was naive about the dangers of helping a desperate stranger, but because she recognized the weight of genuine need when she saw it. She'd been the recipient of such mercy herself when Samuel found her half-starved and fleeing an arranged marriage she couldn't accept, and she knew that sometimes the difference between salvation and destruction was nothing more than one person choosing to open their door instead of closing it. "Get up," she said, slipping her arm under his shoulder and helping him to his feet, surprised by how light he felt, as if the desert had already begun the process of wearing him away to nothing. "Slowly now, don't rush it." The baby's cries grew more insistent as they moved, and Grace could see the way the man's jaw tightened with each sound, the guilt and helplessness of a father who couldn't provide for his child written clearly across his features. She helped him into the trading post, settling him on the wooden bench near the counter while she moved with practiced efficiency to gather what he needed. Water first, cool from the well she'd dug her first year alone, served in small sips because she knew that too much too fast would make him sick. Food next, hardtack and jerky that would be easy on a stomach that had been empty too long. And for the baby, she found the goat's milk she kept for emergencies, warmed over the small fire she maintained in the back room for cooking, as the man drank and the baby nursed from a makeshift bottle fashioned from a whiskey flask and cloth. Grace studied them both with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people as a matter of survival. The man's clothing was well made but worn. His boots were good leather but showed signs of hard travel, and the silver jewelry at his wrists and neck spoke of wealth or status that didn't match his current desperate circumstances. The baby was clean despite their ordeal, wrapped in a blanket that showed the intricate patterns of skilled Navajo weaving, and her robust cries suggested she was healthy and strong despite whatever hardships had brought them here. "What's your name?" Grace asked when the man had drunk enough water to loosen his voice, and she saw the hesitation in his eyes, the quick calculation of how much truth was safe to share with a stranger who'd shown him kindness but might still prove to be an enemy. The pause stretched long enough that Grace began to wonder if he would answer at all, but finally he spoke, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "Matthew," he said, and Grace knew immediately that this was only part of the truth. Probably the name he'd been given by the government agents who insisted on anglicizing every Navajo child they could get their hands on. Matthew Bentley. The surname was Navajo, at least, and Grace felt a small satisfaction in hearing him claim that much of his heritage, even if everything else about his identity remained locked behind walls of caution and fear. "And her?" Grace nodded toward the baby, who had finished the improvised bottle and was now staring up at the rough wooden ceiling with the serious expression of someone trying to make sense of a world that was entirely new and completely overwhelming. Matthew's face softened as he looked down at his daughter, and for a moment, the wariness disappeared, replaced by a love so fierce and protective that Grace felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Her name is Dawn," he said, and Grace.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. back to the story.
Could hear the way his voice changed when he spoke of the child, becoming gentler but also more determined, as if the baby represented not just his daughter, but his reason for continuing to fight against whatever forces had driven him to this desperate flight across the desert. Her mother called her that because she said she was the beginning of something new, something better than what came before. Grace waited for him to say more about the baby's mother, but Matthew's face closed again, the walls going back up as he remembered that he was talking to a stranger whose motives and loyalties were still unknown. Grace didn't push, she'd learned from 3 years of dealing with travelers and traders that some stories came out in their own time, and forcing them usually resulted in lies or silence, neither of which would help her understand what kind of trouble she might be inviting into. Her carefully ordered life. "How long since you've eaten?" she asked instead, moving to the shelves where she kept her personal supplies, the better food that she saved for herself and the occasional guest who earned her trust. Matthew's eyes followed her movements with the alertness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of generosity. But when she placed a plate of real bread and dried fruit in front of him, his resolve crumbled and he began to eat with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen proper food in days. As Matthew ate and Dawn dozed in his arms, Grace found herself studying the pair with growing curiosity and concern. Something about their situation didn't add up, and her years on the frontier had taught her that when things didn't add up, it usually meant trouble was following close behind. A Navajo man traveling alone with an infant was unusual enough, but one who carried himself with the bearing of a warrior despite his current weakness, who wore the jewelry of the wealthy but traveled without horse or supplies, who spoke English with the careful precision of someone who'd been educated in white schools but claimed his tribal name with pride, was a walking contradiction that suggested a story far more complicated than simple hardship. "Where are you headed?" Grace asked when Matthew had eaten enough to take the edge off his hunger. And again she saw that calculating look, the quick assessment of how much truth was safe to reveal. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone once they were made. "Away," Matthew said finally, and the single word carried more weight than a full confession, telling Grace everything and nothing about the forces that had driven him to seek shelter at her remote trading post. "Just away from where we were." It was the kind of answer that raised more questions than it answered, but Grace recognized the tone of someone who'd reached the limits of what they were willing to share with a stranger, no matter how kind that stranger had been. Grace nodded, accepting the non-answer because she understood the need for caution in a world where the wrong words to the wrong person could mean the difference between safety and disaster. She'd kept her own secrets over the years, and she knew that sometimes survival depended on controlling how much of your truth you allowed others to see. But as she watched Matthew hold his daughter with a combination of tenderness and fierce protectiveness, she found herself wanting to know more about what had driven them to her door, and more importantly, what she could do to help them find whatever they were searching for. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon when Grace heard the sound that every frontier dweller learned to recognize and fear, the rhythmic thunder of multiple horses approaching at speed. Matthew heard it too, and Grace watched as his entire body went rigid with tension, his hand moving instinctively to his waist where a gun belt would normally hang, his eyes darting toward the door with the trapped look of an animal that had just realized the hunters were closing in. "Friends of yours?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Matthew was gathering Dawn protectively against his chest, preparing to run even though he clearly didn't have the strength for another desperate flight across the desert. The baby sensed her father's tension and began to fuss, her small voice adding an urgent counterpoint to the approaching hoofbeats. "No," Matthew said, and the word came out flat and final, carrying with it the weight of absolute certainty that whoever was coming meant them harm. "They've been following us for 3 days. I thought maybe the desert would make them give up, but..." He didn't finish the sentence. But Grace could see in his eyes the resignation of someone who'd run out of places to hide and was preparing to make whatever stand he could with whatever strength he had left. Grace moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains, counting the riders as they approached her trading post with the determined pace of men who knew exactly what they were looking for and expected to find it. 6 men, all white, all armed with the casual confidence of those who'd never had to question their right to take whatever they wanted from whoever was too weak to stop them. Their leader was a man Grace recognized, Sheriff Tom Crawford from the county seat, a man whose interpretation of law and order tended to favor whoever had the most money and the least conscience. Sheriff Crawford, Grace said, and she saw Matthew's face go pale at the name, confirming her suspicion that this wasn't a social call or a routine patrol. He's got 5 men with him, and they're coming here with purpose. She turned from the window to find Matthew on his feet despite his weakness. Dawn clutched against his chest as he looked around the small room like a trapped animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "I won't bring trouble to your house," Matthew said, moving toward the door with the unsteady determination of someone prepared to sacrifice himself to protect both his daughter and the woman who'd shown them kindness. "I'll go out and face them, maybe lead them away from here." But Grace was already moving, stepping between Matthew and the door with the kind of firm resolve that had kept her trading post running when everyone said a woman couldn't manage such a business alone. "You'll do no such thing," Grace said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to command respect in a world that preferred to ignore her existence. "Sit down before you fall down and let me handle Sheriff Crawford. I've been dealing with his type since before you were born." She could see the protest forming on Matthew's lips, but she cut him off with a look that had silenced bigger and more dangerous men than him. The hoofbeats had reached her yard now, and through the window Grace could see Crawford, dismounting with the swagger of a man who expected the world to bend to his will. She straightened her shoulders, checked that her appearance was properly intimidating, and opened the door before Crawford could knock, meeting his arrival with the cool composure of someone who owned the ground he was standing on and wasn't impressed by his authority. "Sheriff Crawford," Grace said, her voice carefully neutral despite the anger. She felt at seeing armed men surrounding her home with the obvious intent of causing trouble for the desperate father and child she'd taken under her protection. "What brings you so far from town on such a hot day?" Sheriff Crawford's pale blue eyes swept across Grace's trading post with the calculating gaze of a man who'd made a career out of finding what people didn't want him to find. And when his attention settled on the wooden bench where drops of water still marked the spot where someone had recently been drinking, Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from standing between predator and prey. The sheriff was a tall man gone soft around the middle from too many years of taking what he wanted instead of earning it, but his hands still moved with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with violence, and the 5 men flanking him carried themselves with the loose-limbed confidence of hired guns who'd never met a problem they couldn't solve with bullets. "Mrs. Morales," Crawford said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy, while his eyes continued their methodical inventory of everything within view, searching for signs of the quarry he'd tracked across 30 miles of unforgiving desert. "Beautiful day for a ride, don't you think? Though I have to say, this heat makes a man mighty thirsty. You wouldn't happen to have any cool water for weary travelers, would you?" His tone was friendly enough, but Grace had learned long ago to listen to what men like Crawford didn't say, and the underlying threat in his casual words was clear as a rattlesnake's warning. "Of course, Sheriff," Grace replied, stepping onto the porch and closing the door firmly behind her, a movement that seemed natural but effectively blocked Crawford's view into the interior of the trading post. "I always keep water for travelers. It's the decent thing to do in country like this." She moved to the well beside her house with deliberate calm, drawing up the bucket and filling a tin cup that she handed to Crawford with the steady grace of someone who'd learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of frontier hospitality. Crawford accepted the water but didn't drink immediately, instead holding Grace's gaze with the intensity of a man who'd made a career out of reading guilt in people's faces and finding their breaking points through sheer persistence. You know, Mrs. Morales, we've been tracking a dangerous fugitive across this territory for the better part of a week now. A Navajo by the name of Matthew Bentley, wanted in connection with some very serious crimes back on their reservation. He's traveling with a stolen child, and we have reason to believe he might be headed this way. The lie came so smoothly that Grace almost admired Crawford's skill, but she'd spent enough years dealing with men who twisted truth to serve their purposes that she could recognize deception, even when it was wrapped in official authority. Whatever Matthew had done or hadn't done, Grace was certain that the word stolen didn't apply to his relationship with baby Dawn, and the careful way Crawford avoided specifying what crimes Matthew was supposedly wanted for suggested that the truth was far more complicated than this simple manhunt narrative. Can't say I've seen any Navajo traveling through here recently, Grace said, matching Crawford's casual tone while her mind raced through the implications of his words. Most of the tribal members who trade with me come from the eastern edge of the reservation, and they usually travel in groups. A man alone with a child would be unusual enough that I'd remember it. The partial truth felt solid on her tongue, technically accurate while revealing nothing that would help Crawford in his hunt. One of Crawford's men, a lean scarecrow of a man with the dead eyes of a professional killer, spat tobacco juice into the dust and shifted restlessly in his saddle. Sheriff, we're wasting time talking. That Injun's trail led straight here, and there ain't nowhere else he could have gone. Why don't we just search the place and be done with it? His hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol, and Grace saw the eager anticipation in his expression. The look of a man who hoped for resistance so he'd have an excuse to use violence. Crawford held up a hand to silence his subordinate, but Grace caught the quick glance that passed between them, a moment of communication that suggested this performance had been rehearsed. Now Dalton, Mrs. Morales here is a respected businesswoman and a widow deserving of our protection, not our suspicion. I'm sure if she'd seen anything unusual, she'd tell us about it. The words were respectful, but the emphasis Crawford placed on widow carried an unmistakable implication about her vulnerability and his power. That's very considerate of you, Sheriff, Grace said, her voice carrying just enough steel to let Crawford know that his threats weren't lost on her, but weren't particularly frightening either. As I said, I haven't seen anyone matching that description. But if I do, I'll be sure to send word to town immediately. She began moving back toward her door with the measured pace of someone concluding a conversation. But Crawford's voice stopped her before she could reach the safety of her threshold. You know, Mrs. Morales, it occurs to me that a man desperate enough to steal a child might not be above threatening an innocent woman to gain her cooperation. If someone were to say, force you to lie to lawmen in pursuit of justice, well, that would be understandable. No one would hold such deception against you, especially if you were to correct the record before any real harm was done. Crawford's meaning was crystal clear, offering Grace a face-saving way to betray Matthew while simultaneously threatening consequences if she continued to protect him. Grace felt a surge of anger at Crawford's casual assumption that she could be intimidated into abandoning someone who'd sought her protection, but she kept her expression neutral as she considered her response. Behind the closed door, she knew Matthew was listening to every word, probably preparing to surrender himself to save her from Crawford's implied threats. And the thought of his noble stupidity made her even more determined to outmaneuver the corrupt sheriff who'd tracked them to her door. Sheriff Crawford, Grace said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. I've been running this trading post alone for 3 years now, dealing with everyone from Apache raiders to claim jumpers to men who think a woman's word can be bought or borrowed. If I say I haven't seen your fugitive, it's because I haven't seen him. And if I had seen him, I'd handle the situation according to my own judgment, not according to threats disguised as friendly concern. The temperature of the conversation dropped perceptibly as Crawford's mask of false courtesy slipped enough to reveal the calculating predator beneath. That's mighty independent talk for a woman living alone so far from help, Mrs. Morales. Independence can be a dangerous thing in country like this, especially for someone who might accidentally find herself harboring criminals. His hand moved to rest on his gun belt, not quite a threat, but close enough to make his meaning unmistakable. And that's mighty threatening talk for a man sworn to protect law-abiding citizens. Grace replied, her own hand moving to the small of her back, where she kept a derringer hidden beneath her blouse. Especially when those citizens have done nothing but offer water to thirsty travelers and honest answers to reasonable questions. The standoff stretched between them like a wire-drawn taut, both sides measuring the other's resolve and calculating the cost of escalation. It was the sound of baby Dawn's cry from inside the trading post that broke the tension. A thin wail that cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through silence. Grace saw Crawford's eyes sharpen immediately, his head turning toward the door with the focused intensity of a hunting dog catching scent of its quarry. The cry came again, unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress. And Grace watched Crawford's face transform as he realized that his long pursuit was finally at an end. That's an interesting sound for an empty trading post to be making, Crawford said, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of a man who'd just drawn a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. Almost sounds like a baby crying, doesn't it? Now that's curious, because according to my information, you don't have any children of your own, Mrs. Morales. So whose child might that be? His men were already dismounting, hands moving to their weapons with the casual efficiency of professionals preparing for violence. Grace felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, knowing that her next words would determine whether this confrontation ended in bloodshed or negotiation. Behind the door, Matthew was probably preparing to fight his way out with whatever strength he had left, determined to protect both his daughter and the woman who'd shown them mercy. And Grace knew that such noble desperation would only result in tragedy for everyone involved. That would be my niece, Grace said, the lie coming to her lips with surprising ease as her mind raced ahead to construct a believable story. My sister's child, brought here for safekeeping while she recovers from a difficult birth. Surely you wouldn't begrudge a woman the right to care for family in their time of need? It was a thin deception, but it bought her time to think while forcing Crawford to choose between accepting her explanation or openly calling her a liar. Crawford's smile was sharp as a blade as he stepped closer to the door, close enough that Grace could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his pale eyes. Your niece, you say? Well, Mrs. Morales, I'd be much obliged if you'd introduce me to this niece of yours. I'm sure she's a lovely child, and it would put my mind at ease to see that she's being properly cared for. His tone was conversational, but his meaning was clear. He intended to search her trading post whether she consented or not. I'm afraid the baby is sleeping, Grace said, positioning herself more firmly in front of the door while her mind searched desperately for some way to avoid the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. And you know how fussy infants can be when they're disturbed by strangers. Perhaps you could come back another time when. But Crawford was already pushing past her, his hand shoving her aside with casual brutality as he reached for the door handle. The door opened to reveal Matthew Bentley standing in the center of the room with baby Dawn cradled against his chest, his face set in the resigned expression of a man who'd run out of places to hide and was prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. He'd used the time during Grace's conversation with Crawford to gather his meager possessions and prepare Dawn for travel, wrapping her carefully in the blanket that had protected her during their desert crossing, and securing the small bundle of supplies Grace had given them. Well, Crawford said, his voice rich with satisfaction as he stepped into the trading post with his hand resting on his pistol. Matthew Bentley, I presume? You've led us quite a chase across some mighty uncomfortable country. I hope you enjoyed your little vacation from justice, because it's time to come back and face the music for what you've done." His men filed in. Behind him, filling the small space with the bulk and menace of armed authority, Matthew's dark eyes met Grace's for a moment, and she saw in them a mixture of gratitude and apology, the look of a man who regretted bringing danger to someone, who'd shown him kindness, but who had no regrets about the choices that led him to this moment. "I never meant for Mrs. Morales to be involved in this," he said, his voice steady despite the desperate circumstances. "She gave me water and food out of Christian charity, nothing more. If you have business with me, let's conduct it away from her property." "Oh, but Mrs. Morales has made herself very much a part of this business," Crawford replied, his attention shifting between Matthew and Grace with the predatory focus of someone savoring a moment of complete control. Harboring fugitives, lying to lawmen, interfering with the pursuit of justice, these are serious crimes, Mrs. Morales. The kind of crimes that could cost a woman her property, her freedom, even her life if the circumstances were particularly aggravating. Grace felt a cold rage building in her chest as she watched Crawford's performance, recognizing the calculated cruelty of a man who enjoyed using his authority to torment those who couldn't fight back. "What exactly are you accusing Mr. Bentley of, Sheriff? Because so far, all I've heard are vague references to unspecified crimes and a lot of threats directed at people who've done nothing but try to help a man and his child in obvious distress." Crawford's laugh was harsh and humorless as he reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document that he shook open with theatrical flourish. "Matthew Bentley stands accused of murder. Mrs. Morales, the murder of Indian Agent James Morrison and 2 federal marshals who were attempting to arrest him for previous crimes against the government. He's also wanted for the kidnapping of this child, who is scheduled to be removed from the reservation for proper Christian education, according to federal mandate." The words hit Grace like physical blows, but she saw immediately that Matthew's reaction wasn't the shocked denial of an innocent man, but rather the weary resignation of someone who'd heard these accusations before and knew how futile it was to protest his innocence to men who'd already decided his guilt. Baby Dawn chose that moment to begin crying again, her voice rising in distress as she sensed the tension and fear radiating from the adults around her. "Those men came to take her away," Matthew said, his voice cutting through Dawn's cries with quiet intensity. "Agent Morrison said the government had decided that Dawn would be better off at a boarding school, away from the corrupting influence of tribal customs. When I refused to hand her over, they tried to take her by force. I defended my daughter." Nothing more, his words carried the ring of truth. But Grace could see from Crawford's expression that truth was irrelevant to whatever agenda had brought him here. "The law says that Indian children belong in civilized institutions where they can be properly educated and prepared for productive lives in American society," Crawford replied, his tone taking on the sanctimonious quality of someone quoting official policy. "Your refusal to comply with federal mandate makes you a criminal, Bentley, and your violent resistance to lawful arrest makes you a murderer. The fact that you've dragged this innocent woman into your crimes only makes matters worse." Grace watched the exchange with growing understanding of the forces that had driven Matthew to her door, recognizing the familiar pattern of government officials using law and authority to justify the destruction of families that didn't conform to their vision of proper society. She'd seen it before in her own community, where Mexican-American families were routinely separated and their children placed in institutions designed to strip away every trace of their cultural identity. "How much?" Grace asked suddenly, her question cutting through Crawford's self-righteous speech like a knife through fabric. "How much is someone paying you to bring back that baby? Because this isn't about law or justice or protecting children. This is about money, and I want to know how much it's worth to whoever sent you." Her direct challenge clearly caught Crawford off guard. and she saw him exchange a quick glance with his men, before his expression hardened into something openly threatening. "Careful, Mrs. Morales," Crawford said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're already in enough trouble without adding bribery of a federal officer to your crimes. Sometimes it's better to accept that you're in over your head and cooperate with those who have the authority to help you." His hand moved to his pistol in a gesture that was no longer subtle, and Grace realized that the time for verbal sparring was rapidly coming to an end. Matthew stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Crawford and Grace while still protecting Don with his body. "Sheriff, you have what you came for. I'll come with you peacefully if you give me your word that Mrs. Morales won't be charged with any crime for helping us. She didn't know who I was or what I was accused of when she gave us shelter." His willingness to sacrifice himself to protect Grace was both noble and heartbreaking, but Grace could see that Crawford had no intention of honoring any agreement. That didn't serve his own purposes. "I'm afraid it's too late for bargaining." Banally, Crawford replied with cruel satisfaction. Mrs. Morales made her choice when she decided to harbor a fugitive and lie to federal officers. You have to face the consequences of that choice, just like you'll have to face the consequences of yours. The only question now is whether this ends quietly or whether we have to get unpleasant about it. His men spread out slightly, filling the available space and making it clear that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The sound of horses approaching at speed cut through the tension like thunder across a clear sky, causing everyone in the room to freeze as the drumbeat of hooves grew louder and more urgent. Through the window, Grace could see dust rising in the distance, marking the approach of riders moving with the kind of purpose that suggested either rescue or additional trouble, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited to discover which it would be. Crawford's face darkened as he realized that his carefully planned arrest was about to become complicated by the arrival of unknown variables, and Grace saw him gesture sharply to his men to prepare for whatever was coming their way. Matthew's expression remained carefully neutral, but Grace caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he recognized something about the approaching riders that the others had missed. The first rider to enter the yard was a Navajo man of perhaps 50 years, his long gray hair braided with silver and turquoise, his bearing carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command and respect. Behind him rode 4 younger men, all armed but not in the aggressive manner of Crawford's hired guns, their weapons carried with the casual competence of warriors rather than the eager violence of killers. Grace watched through the window as the lead rider dismounted with fluid grace despite his age, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in all its forms. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the afternoon air, pitched to reach everyone within the trading post while maintaining the dignified calm of someone who expected to be heard and obeyed. "I am Joseph Begay," the man announced, his English accented but precise, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood the power of language to shape perception and outcome. "I have come to speak with Sheriff Crawford about the man you pursue. There are things you do not understand about this situation, things that must be explained before innocent blood is shed over lies and misunderstandings." Joseph Begay's weathered hands moved with deliberate ceremony as he dismounted from his painted horse, each movement carrying the weight of tradition and the careful dignity of a man who had spent decades navigating between 2 worlds that rarely understood each other. His presence seemed to shift something fundamental in the atmosphere around Grace's trading post, transforming what had been a simple manhunt into something far more complex and dangerous, a collision between federal authority and tribal sovereignty that had been brewing since the first government agents set foot on Navajo land. Crawford's face had gone pale beneath his sunburn as he recognized the implications of Joseph Begay's arrival, because even a corrupt sheriff understood that arresting a Navajo in the presence of tribal elders was a different proposition entirely from cornering a lone fugitive with no witnesses to speak for him. The 4 younger warriors who flanked Joseph moved with the fluid alertness of men who had been raised to protect their people from exactly this kind of government overreach, and their quiet confidence suggested they were prepared to back their elders' words with action if necessary. "Mr. Begay," Crawford said, his voice carefully controlled as he stepped back from Matthew while keeping his hand near his weapon. "I appreciate your concern for your people, but this is a matter of federal law enforcement. Matthew Bentley is wanted for serious crimes against government officials, and I have a legal warrant for his arrest. Tribal politics don't supersede federal authority." His words carried the automatic arrogance of someone who had never questioned his right to impose his will on others. But Grace could hear the underlying nervousness that came from suddenly finding himself outnumbered by men who didn't recognize his authority. Joseph's dark eyes moved slowly from Crawford to his men, then to Matthew holding baby Dawn, and finally to Grace standing protectively near them both, taking in every detail of the scene with the methodical attention of someone who had learned to read the truth behind men's words and actions. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent years mediating between conflicting versions of reality, seeking the threads of truth that could prevent bloodshed and injustice. "Sheriff Crawford, I have spoken with the families of the men who died on the reservation 3 weeks ago," Joseph said, his words falling into the heated silence like stones into still water. "Agent Morrison and the marshals who came with him were not killed by Matthew Bentley in cold blood, as your warrant claims. They were killed while attempting to take his newborn daughter by force, in violation of treaties that guarantee tribal members the right to raise their children according to our customs." The precision of his words made it clear that this was not speculation but carefully gathered testimony from witnesses Crawford had chosen to ignore. Crawford's jaw tightened as he realized that his carefully constructed narrative was about to be challenged by inconvenient facts. But his years of experience in manipulating legal proceedings had taught him that truth was often less important than the ability to control which version of events reached the proper authorities. "Mr. Begay, with all due respect to your position, in the tribal community, witness statements from reservation Indians aren't likely to carry much weight in federal court. The law recognizes that primitive peoples often have difficulty distinguishing between their emotional attachments and objective reality." The casual racism in Crawford's dismissal of Navajo testimony sparked a visible reaction from Joseph's warriors, their hands moving toward their weapons with the controlled anger of men who had heard such insults too many times to let them pass unchallenged. But Joseph himself remained outwardly calm, though Grace could see the steel beneath his diplomatic exterior as he prepared to address Crawford's assumptions about Navajo credibility and federal authority. "Sheriff," Joseph said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone invoking legal precedent rather than making personal appeals. "The Treaty of Bosque Redondo specifically guarantees that Navajo children cannot be removed from their families without due process that includes tribal representation. Agent Morrison violated that treaty when he attempted to seize Dawn Bentley without proper hearings or tribal consent. Matthew was within his rights to defend his daughter against unlawful seizure." His words carried the weight of someone who had spent years studying the legal documents that governed the relationship between his people and the federal government. Grace watched the exchange with growing understanding of the larger forces that had driven Matthew to her door, recognizing that this was about far more than one man's resistance to government authority. This was about a systematic campaign to destroy Navajo families by taking their children and erasing every trace of their cultural identity, a policy that treated loving parents as obstacles to be overcome rather than rights bearers to be respected. Matthew stepped forward slightly, shifting Dawn to a more secure position against his chest as he prepared to speak for himself, rather than letting others argue his case. "Joseph," he said, using the elder's first name with the familiarity of someone who had known him since childhood, "you don't need to put yourself at risk for my sake. I knew what I was doing when I chose to fight rather than let them take her. I'm prepared to face the consequences of that choice. His willingness to sacrifice himself to protect others was noble but misguided. And Grace could see that Joseph had no intention of allowing such unnecessary martyrdom. Matthew Bentley, Joseph replied, his voice carrying the authority of an elder addressing a younger member of his community. You are not alone in this. Fight, and you never were. The same government agents who came for your daughter have taken 12 other children from our reservation in the past 6 months, all under the same false pretenses of providing better education and opportunities. Your resistance has given us the chance to challenge this policy in federal court, but only if you survive to testify about what really happened. Crawford's face darkened as he realized that his simple arrest was turning into something far more complicated and potentially embarrassing for the government officials who had sent him. The last thing his superiors wanted was public attention focused on their child removal policies, especially if that attention included testimony from articulate Navajo, witnesses who could expose the gap between official justifications and actual practices. This is all very touching, Crawford said, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he prepared to reassert his authority through the threat of violence. But I have my orders, and those orders don't include conducting a debate about federal Indian policy. Matthew Bentley is under arrest for murder, and anyone who interferes with that arrest will be charged as an accessory after the fact. His men shifted slightly, making it clear that they were prepared to enforce Crawford's will through whatever means proved necessary. It was Grace who broke the growing tension with a question that cut straight to the heart of Crawford's motivations. Her frontier-honed instincts telling her that there was something personal driving the sheriff's determination to arrest Matthew regardless of the evidence or consequences. Sheriff Crawford, who exactly is paying you to bring back that baby? Because this level of effort for one Navajo child suggests someone with deep pockets and deeper reasons for wanting her specifically. Her direct challenge clearly struck a nerve, and she saw Crawford's hand move closer to his pistol as his mask of official authority slipped enough to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Grace watched as Joseph's expression sharpened with new understanding of the forces they were facing. It was one thing to deal with misguided government policy implemented by well-meaning but ignorant officials, and quite another to confront corruption that used official authority to serve private interests at the expense of innocent families. Mrs. Morales, Crawford said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge as he abandoned any pretense of courtesy or legal procedure. You've already interfered enough in matters that don't concern you. I suggest you step aside and let us complete our business before you find yourself facing charges that could cost you everything you've worked to build here. His threat was clear, but Grace had faced down too many bullies over the years to be intimidated by one more man who thought his badge gave him the right to terrorize innocent people. Actually, Sheriff, Joseph interjected, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Mrs. Morales raises an excellent question, one that goes to the heart of why federal agents would violate treaty rights to seize one specific child when there are hundreds of Navajo children on the reservation. Unless, of course, Don Bentley represents something more valuable than just another opportunity for cultural education. His implication was clear, and Grace saw understanding dawn on Matthew's face as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Matthew's dark eyes widened as he processed Joseph's words, and when he spoke, his voice carried the shock of someone discovering that his personal tragedy was part of a much larger conspiracy. The mineral rights, he said, his voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of the plot against his family became clear. Dawn's mother Sarah inherited land on the reservation that hasn't been surveyed for the new mineral assessments. If Dawn dies or disappears, that land reverts to the tribal trust, where it can be more easily acquired by government negotiation. The revelation hit the assembled group like a physical blow. transforming what had seemed like zealous enforcement of misguided policy into something far more sinister and calculating. Grace felt a cold rage building in her chest as she realized that Dawn's very existence stood between corrupt officials and valuable mining claims that could be worth thousands of dollars to the right people. Crawford's face had gone rigid, with the expression of a man who had just heard his carefully hidden motivations exposed in front of witnesses who could destroy his career and freedom with their testimony. "You're talking nonsense," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Grace could see the desperation creeping into his eyes as he realized that his simple arrest had become a complex legal and political disaster. "Am I?" Matthew replied, his voice gaining strength as the full picture of the conspiracy against his family came into focus. Sarah's grandfather was one of the original treaty signers who reserved mineral rights for individual tribal members. Her land has never been properly surveyed because it's in a remote part of the reservation, but recent geological surveys suggest it might contain significant copper deposits. If Dawn inherits that land as Sarah's only heir, it complicates any government attempts to renegotiate mineral extraction agreements. Joseph nodded grimly as Matthew's explanation confirmed suspicions that had been building among tribal leaders. For months, the growing pattern of children disappearing from families who held particularly valuable or strategically important land claims. "This is why they wanted her in a government boarding school," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "Not for education, but for control. Children raised away from their families often lose track of their inheritance rights, especially when those rights are deliberately obscured by sympathetic teachers and administrators." Grace watched Crawford's men exchange nervous glances as the conversation revealed the scope of the conspiracy they had been unknowingly serving, and she could see that at least some of them were having second thoughts about their involvement in what they now understood was a criminal scheme rather than legitimate law enforcement. The corruption that had seemed like easy money was suddenly looking like potential prison time for everyone involved. "This is all speculation and conspiracy theories," Crawford said, but his voice had taken on the shrill edge of a man who knew his position was becoming untenable. "I have legal warrants and federal authority, and I intend to execute my duties regardless of whatever wild stories you people choose to tell yourselves." He gestured sharply to his men, clearly preparing to end the discussion through force, but Grace was already moving, positioning herself between the corrupt sheriff and the family he sought to destroy. "Actually, Sheriff," Grace said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had just realized she held all the cards in this particular game, "I think you'll find that your authority doesn't extend to searching private property without proper warrants or compelling citizens to surrender legally protected guests. This is my land, and these people are under my protection." Her words were a direct challenge to Crawford's power, but they were backed by the presence of Joseph's warriors and the growing understanding that this confrontation was being witnessed by people who could expose the truth about government corruption. The standoff stretched taut between them, federal authority facing tribal sovereignty and frontier independence in a confrontation that could easily escalate into violence if someone made the wrong move. Dawn chose that moment to begin crying again, her voice cutting through the tension with the innocent urgency of new life, demanding attention and protection from the adult world that seemed determined to use her as a pawn in their larger games of power and greed. It was one of Crawford's own men who broke the stalemate, a young deputy named Carson who had joined the sheriff's force believing he was serving justice rather than corruption. "Sheriff," he said, his voice uncertain but determined, "maybe we should head back to town and get some guidance from the federal prosecutor before we proceed. This situation seems more complicated than what we were briefed on." His words gave Crawford's other men permission to express their own doubts about the mission they had signed up for. Crawford's face twisted with rage as he realized that his own men were abandoning him at the crucial moment, leaving him isolated and exposed in front of witnesses who could destroy him with their testimony. "You're all making a serious mistake," He snarled, his hand moving to his pistol with the desperate aggression of a cornered animal. "When this is over, everyone who interfered with this arrest will answer for their crimes." But his threats rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence that he was the one who had committed crimes in service of his hidden agenda. Joseph stepped forward with the dignity of someone who had spent decades dealing with corrupt officials and their empty threats, his presence radiating the calm authority of someone who understood exactly how to handle bullies, who relied on fear rather than law to achieve their goals. "Sheriff Crawford," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone making an official declaration, "I am formally requesting that tribal representatives be present for any further proceedings involving Matthew Benelli and his daughter. Under federal treaty obligations, we have the right to observe and participate in legal matters affecting tribal members." The request was perfectly legal and impossible to refuse without openly admitting that Crawford's actions violated federal law. But Grace could see that the corrupt sheriff was beyond caring about legal niceties as his carefully planned operation collapsed around him. The sound of more horses approaching from the distance suggested that word of the confrontation was spreading, and soon there would be too many witnesses for Crawford to intimidate or silence. Grace felt a surge of hope as she realized that Matthew and Dawn might actually survive this encounter, not through violence or flight, but through the simple power of truth exposed in front of people who were willing to stand up for justice. The desert had taught her that survival often depended on recognizing when the odds had shifted in your favor, and she could sense that the balance of power was finally beginning to tip away from corruption and toward the protection of innocent families. The riders emerging from the heat shimmer on the horizon carried with them the weight of federal authority that could either salvation or damnation depending on whose orders they followed, and Grace felt her heart sink as she recognized the military bearing and pristine uniforms that marked them as cavalry officers rather than the additional tribal support she had been hoping for. Captain William Hayes of the 10th Cavalry rode at their head, his weathered face grim with the expression of a career soldier who had seen too many ugly confrontations between competing authorities to have any illusions about how such standoffs typically ended. Crawford's face brightened with renewed confidence as he counted the approaching soldiers, clearly believing that federal military support would tip the balance back in his favor and allow him to complete his mission despite the inconvenient presence of tribal witnesses and an increasingly uncooperative local population. "Captain Hayes," he called out with evident relief. "Perfect timing. I have a dangerous fugitive in custody and some locals who seem confused about their obligations to federal law enforcement." His words carried the smug satisfaction of someone who believed the cavalry's arrival had validated his authority and resolved the standoff in his favor. But Captain Hayes's expression remained carefully neutral as he dismounted and surveyed the scene with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that the truth was rarely as simple as initial reports suggested, especially when those reports came from civilian officials with their own agendas to pursue. His dark eyes moved from Crawford's aggressive posture to Joseph Begay's dignified calm, from Matthew's protective stance over baby Dawn to Grace's defiant positioning between the corrupt sheriff and the family he sought to destroy. "Sheriff Crawford," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent years navigating the complex politics of frontier law enforcement. "I received word that you were pursuing a dangerous fugitive in this area, but the situation I'm observing doesn't match the briefing I was given. Perhaps you could explain why a peaceful trading post appears to have become the site of an armed confrontation between federal officers and tribal representatives." His question was carefully phrased to avoid taking sides while demanding clarity about what was actually happening rather than what Crawford claimed was happening. Grace watched the interaction with growing hope as she realized that Captain Hayes was not simply another corrupt official prepared to rubber-stamp Crawford's actions, but rather a professional soldier who understood the importance of getting accurate information before making decisions that could have far-reaching consequences. The captain's reputation among the local settlers was that of a fair man who enforced the law without the casual brutality that characterized so many of his contemporaries. Joseph Begay stepped forward with the formal bearing of someone addressing a military officer with whom he had dealt before, his voice carrying the respectful but firm tone of someone who understood protocol but refused to be intimidated by rank or authority. Captain Hayes, I am Joseph Begay of the Navajo Nation, and I am here to ensure that federal treaty obligations are observed in the treatment of Matthew Bentley and his infant daughter. Sheriff Crawford has made serious accusations against Mr. Bentley, but those accusations appear to contradict the testimony of witnesses to the events in question. The captain's attention sharpened at the mention of treaty obligations, because military officers were typically far more aware than civilian law enforcement of the legal complexities surrounding tribal sovereignty and federal responsibilities to Native American communities. Mr. Begay, Hayes replied with the courtesy of someone who recognized Joseph's standing in the tribal hierarchy. What specific treaty violations are you alleging, and what evidence do you have to support those allegations? His question demonstrated a willingness to consider Joseph's concerns rather than simply dismissing them as Crawford had attempted to do. Matthew shifted baby Dawn to a more secure position as he prepared to speak for himself rather than allowing others to argue his case. His voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion that came from weeks of running and the emotional strain of defending his daughter against impossible odds. Captain, Agent Morrison and 2 federal marshals came to the reservation 3 weeks ago with orders to remove my daughter from my care and place her in a government boarding school. When I refused to surrender her, they attempted to take her by force. I defended my child, and 3 men died in the struggle that followed. His words were simple and direct, carrying the ring of truth that comes from someone who has nothing left to lose by telling the complete story. Crawford's face darkened as he realized that Matthew's straightforward account of events was far more compelling than the carefully constructed narrative of unprovoked murder that formed the basis of his arrest warrant. But he pressed forward with the desperation of someone whose entire scheme depended on preventing the truth from being examined too closely. Captain, this man is a dangerous criminal who killed federal agents in cold blood. His story about defending his child is nothing more than an attempt to justify murderous resistance to lawful authority. His words carried the automatic authority of someone accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. Grace could no longer remain silent as she watched Crawford attempt to twist the truth into something that would justify his corruption and the destruction of an innocent family, her frontier-bred sense of justice demanding that she speak up for people who had no one else to defend them against the machinery of government oppression. Captain Hayes, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had earned respect through years of honest dealing with everyone from Apache warriors to territorial governors. I've been operating this trading post for 3 years, and I've never seen anything that suggests Mr. Bentley is dangerous to anyone except those who threaten his daughter. The captain's attention turned to Grace, with the interest of someone who recognized that civilian witnesses often provided more reliable information than official reports, especially when those witnesses had no obvious agenda beyond seeking truth and justice. Mrs. Morales, I take it you've had the opportunity to observe Mr. Bentley's behavior during his time at your trading post, and you'd be willing to testify about what you've observed. His question suggested that he was genuinely interested in gathering accurate information rather than simply validating Crawford's predetermined conclusions. I would, Grace replied firmly, meeting the captain's steady gaze with her own unwavering stare. Mr. Bentley arrived here exhausted and dehydrated, carrying his infant daughter, who was obviously his primary concern despite his own desperate condition. In the time he's been here, I've seen nothing but devotion to that child and gratitude for the help he's been given. If that's the behavior of a dangerous criminal, then I've been badly misinformed about what constitutes criminal behavior. Her words carried the conviction of someone who had seen enough of life to distinguish between genuine threats and manufactured ones. Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully as he processed Grace's testimony, clearly weighing it against the official reports he had received and finding the discrepancies troubling enough to warrant further investigation. Sheriff Crawford, do you have documentation of the specific crimes Mr. Bentley is alleged to have committed? Witness statements, physical evidence, anything beyond the initial incident report. His request was perfectly reasonable from a military perspective, but Grace could see that it put Crawford in an impossible position since his case depended entirely on preventing any serious examination of the evidence. The corrupt sheriff's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents that supposedly justified his pursuit of Matthew and Dawn, but Grace could see from his expression that he knew those papers would not withstand the kind of scrutiny that Captain Hayes was prepared to apply. Captain, I have a federal warrant for Matthew Bentley's arrest on charges of murder and kidnapping. The details of the investigation are sensitive matters that don't require discussion in front of hostile witnesses. His evasion was transparent, enough that even his own men shifted uncomfortably as they realized their sheriff was attempting to hide something from a superior officer. Joseph Begay's voice cut through Crawford's attempted deflection with the precision of someone who had spent years studying the legal documents that governed the relationship between tribal and federal authority, his words carrying the weight of careful research and bitter experience with government officials who preferred convenient lies to inconvenient truths. Captain Hayes, under the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, Navajo children cannot be removed from their families without due process. That includes tribal representation and appeals procedures. Agent Morrison violated that treaty when he attempted to seize Dawn Bentley without proper hearings, making Matthew's resistance not only justified but legally protected. The captain's expression grew increasingly grim as he processed the legal implications of Joseph's statement, recognizing that if the tribal elder was correct, then the entire foundation of Crawford's case was built on federal agents violating their own legal obligations. Military officers took treaty obligations seriously because they understood that breaking agreements with tribal nations could lead to widespread conflict that would inevitably involve the army in bloody and expensive campaigns. Mr. Begay, Captain Hayes said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone addressing matters of significant legal importance. Are you prepared to provide documentation of these treaty provisions and evidence that proper procedures were not followed? In this case, because if federal agents did indeed violate treaty obligations, then this becomes a matter for military investigation rather than civilian law enforcement. His words sent a visible chill through Crawford, who clearly understood that military justice was far less susceptible to the kind of corruption that had characterized his civilian career. It was at this crucial moment that baby Dawn chose to make her presence felt in the conversation, her clear voice rising in a cry that cut through the political complexities and legal maneuvering to remind everyone present that at the heart of this dispute was a living child whose future depended on the decisions being made by the adults around her. Matthew immediately began the gentle swaying motion that had become second nature to him during their weeks of flight. His attention focused entirely on his daughter's comfort, despite the momentous events unfolding around them. Grace watched the tender interaction between father and child with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak, recognizing in Matthew's gentle care the same devotion she had seen in her own father during her childhood, the kind of love that would sacrifice everything to protect what mattered most. The sight of this strong man reduced to desperate flight to protect his daughter touched something deep in her heart that had been dormant since Samuel's death, awakening feelings of protectiveness and loyalty that surprised her with their intensity. Captain Hayes' attention was also drawn to the obvious bond between Matthew and Dawn, his experienced eye recognizing the genuine affection and competent care that marked a devoted parent, rather than the desperate control of someone who had stolen a child for nefarious purposes. "Sheriff Crawford," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge as inconsistencies in the official story became increasingly apparent. If Mr. Bentley kidnapped this child as your warrant alleges, why does she appear so comfortable in his care? And where exactly did this kidnapping supposedly take place? His questions were designed to expose the holes in Crawford's fabricated narrative. Crawford's face had gone pale as he realized that his carefully constructed story was falling apart under the kind of professional scrutiny he had never expected to face. His corruption suddenly exposed to the harsh light of military discipline and legal precision. Captain, the circumstances of the case are complex, and I don't think it's appropriate to discuss sensitive details in front of civilians who may have their own agendas. His attempt to classify the conversation was a desperate last resort, but one that backfired spectacularly when it became clear he was trying to hide information from a superior officer. "Sheriff," Captain Hayes replied, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had reached the limits of his patience with evasion and deception. "I am a federal officer investigating potential violations of treaty law and possible misconduct by civilian authorities. You will provide me with complete documentation of your case against Mr. Bentley, or I will place you under military detention while I conduct my own investigation into this matter." His threat was not empty bluster, but the serious commitment of someone prepared to follow through on his responsibilities, regardless of political consequences. The sound of additional horses approaching from multiple directions suddenly filled the air, and Grace looked up to see dust clouds rising from several points on the horizon as news of the confrontation spread and drew interested parties from across the territory. Some of the riders appeared to be tribal members responding to word that Joseph Begay needed support, while others looked like territorial officials and possibly even federal agents, summoned by reports of a complex legal dispute involving treaty violations and corrupt law enforcement. Matthew's grip on Dawn tightened protectively as he recognized that their private struggle for survival was rapidly becoming a public spectacle that could either provide them with the protection of witnesses and legal oversight or expose them to even greater dangers from the powerful interests that wanted Dawn to disappear. "Captain," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious strain of holding his daughter while surrounded by armed men whose intentions remained unclear. "Whatever happens to me, I ask that you ensure my daughter's safety. She's innocent of whatever crimes I'm accused of, and she deserves protection, regardless of what you decide about my fate." Grace felt her heart clench at Matthew's willingness to sacrifice himself for his daughter's protection, recognizing in his words the same kind of selfless love that had motivated Samuel to marry her, despite his family's disapproval and social pressure to choose someone more acceptable to frontier society. The parallel was not lost on her, and she found herself stepping closer to Matthew and Dawn, her body language making it clear that any attempt to separate them would have to go through her first. Captain Hayes studied the small group with the calculating gaze of someone weighing multiple factors and possible outcomes, clearly recognizing that his next decisions would have far-reaching consequences not just for Matthew and Dawn, but for the delicate balance between federal authority and tribal sovereignty that kept the peace across the entire territory. "Mr. Bentley," he said finally, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone making an official determination, pending a complete investigation into the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Agent Morrison and the federal marshals. "You will remain in protective custody rather than facing immediate arrest. Mrs. Morales, I'm requesting that you continue to provide shelter for Mr. Bentley and his daughter while this matter is resolved through proper legal channels." The captain's decision sent shockwaves through the assembled group, with Crawford's face twisting in rage at seeing his carefully planned operation completely derailed by military intervention, while Joseph Begay's expression showed cautious satisfaction at achieving temporary protection for Matthew and Dawn without the bloodshed that had seemed increasingly inevitable. Grace felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension as she realized that her trading post was about to become the center of a legal and political storm that could reshape the relationship between federal authority and individual rights across the entire territory. The dawn that broke over Grace's trading post 3 days after Captain Hayes established his temporary camp brought with it a parade of territorial officials, federal investigators, and newspaper correspondents whose arrival transformed the remote outpost into an unlikely center of political attention that would determine not just Matthew and Dawn's fate, but the future of federal Indian policy across the entire Southwest. Grace stood at her kitchen window watching the controlled chaos unfold in her yard, where military tents had sprouted like mushrooms after rain, and the constant stream of visitors had turned her quiet sanctuary into something resembling a frontier courthouse during a celebrated murder trial. Matthew sat at her kitchen table feeding Dawn from a bottle that Grace had fashioned from materials in her store, his movements gentle and practiced despite the obvious strain of living under constant scrutiny from investigators who viewed every interaction between father and daughter as potential evidence in their competing theories about his guilt or innocence. The past 3 days had aged him visibly, not from physical hardship, but from the emotional exhaustion of defending his love for his child against people who seemed determined to find sinister motives in the most natural expressions of paternal devotion. The territorial governor's representative arrived an hour ago, Grace said, pouring coffee for Matthew while keeping her voice low enough to avoid being overheard by the guards Captain Hayes had stationed outside her door. He's been asking questions about mineral rights and land ownership, which suggests someone in Santa Fe is taking a very personal interest in this case. Her words carried implications that both she and Matthew understood perfectly, because territorial politics in 1885 were driven primarily by the potential wealth that could be extracted from Indian lands through legal manipulation and administrative sleight of hand. Matthew's dark eyes met hers across the table with the weary understanding of someone who had spent weeks piecing together the conspiracy against his family, recognizing that Dawn's inheritance represented far more than sentimental value to the men who were orchestrating this elaborate campaign of legal persecution. Sarah's grandfather told her stories about the old treaties, about how the government promised that mineral rights would stay with tribal families in perpetuity. But perpetuity has a way of becoming temporary when there's enough money involved, he said, his voice carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned that justice was often secondary to profit in territorial politics. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted their conversation, followed by a respectful knock that indicated military courtesy rather than the aggressive demands that had characterized Crawford's approach to law enforcement. Grace opened the door to find Captain Hayes standing with a woman she didn't recognize, a well-dressed lady whose bearing suggested both education and authority despite her relatively young age. "Mrs. Morales," Captain Hayes said, his tone carrying the formal courtesy of someone conducting official business. "I'd like you to meet Miss Rebecca Armstrong from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington. She's been sent to investigate the circumstances surrounding Agent Morrison's death and the broader questions about child removal policies that have been raised by this case." His introduction was carefully neutral, but Grace caught the subtle emphasis he placed on the word investigate, suggesting that Miss Armstrong's mission was more than just bureaucratic fact-finding. Rebecca Armstrong stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the only woman in rooms full of men who questioned her authority, her intelligent eyes taking in every detail of Grace's kitchen and the domestic scene, of Matthew caring for Dawn with obvious competence and affection. "Mrs. Morales, Mr. Bentley," she said, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone who had learned to communicate complex ideas clearly and concisely. "I've been reviewing the documentation surrounding this case, and I have several questions about federal procedures that may have been violated in the process of attempting to remove Dawn from her father's care." Grace studied the newcomer with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between government officials who genuinely sought justice and those who merely provided a more sophisticated facade for the same old corruption and abuse of power. Miss Armstrong's question seemed pointed toward exposing procedural violations rather than defending them, which suggested either genuine reform impulses or a more subtle form of political maneuvering. Matthew shifted Dawn to his shoulder and began the gentle patting motion that had become automatic whenever she showed signs of restlessness. His attention focused on Miss Armstrong with the wary hope of someone who had been betrayed too, many times to trust easily, but who desperately needed allies in his fight to protect his daughter. "Miss Armstrong," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "what specific violations are you investigating? And what authority do you have to address them if violations are confirmed?" His question went straight to the heart of whether this new development represented genuine hope or merely another layer of bureaucratic theater. "Mr. Bentley," Rebecca replied, consulting a leather portfolio filled with official documents and handwritten notes. "The Bureau has received reports that Agent Morrison exceeded his authority when he attempted to remove your daughter without following established procedures for tribal consultation and appeals processes. If those reports are accurate, then his actions violated not only federal law, but also specific directives from Washington regarding the implementation of educational policies on Indian reservations." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood the legal complexities involved and was prepared to hold federal agents accountable for their actions. Captain Hayes cleared his throat with the diplomatic caution of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of competing federal jurisdictions, his military experience teaching him that territorial politics could be far more dangerous than frontier warfare when careers and reputations were at stake. "Miss Armstrong has also been briefed on the allegations regarding mineral rights and potential corruption in the territorial administration," he said, his words carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations while making it clear that the investigation had expanded far beyond the original charges against Matthew. Grace felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension as she realized that the federal government's interest in this case might actually work in Matthew and Dawn's favor rather than against them. But her frontier-bred skepticism reminded her that Washington politics were often more concerned with avoiding embarrassment than achieving justice. "Miss Armstrong," she said, her voice carrying the direct honesty that had served her well in 3 years of frontier trading, "what happens to Matthew and Dawn while you're conducting your investigation? Because bureaucratic justice has a way of moving slowly while real people suffer real consequences." The question hung in the air with the weight of accumulated frustration from everyone who had watched government machinery grind slowly forward, while innocent lives hung in the balance, and Grace could see from Miss Armstrong's expression that she understood both the urgency of the situation and the limitations of her own authority to provide immediate relief. "Mrs. Morales," she replied with the careful honesty of someone who refused to make promises she couldn't keep, "my investigation will take several weeks to complete, during which time Mr. Bentley and his daughter will remain under military protection. But I can't guarantee what decisions will be made in Washington once my report is filed." It was at this moment that Joseph Begay appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave with news that would complicate an already complex situation in ways that none of them had anticipated. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone delivering information that could change everything, "I've received word from the reservation that Agent Morrison's replacement has arrived with new orders regarding Navajo children. He's brought additional marshals and is preparing to resume removal operations immediately." His words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of alarm through everyone present. Matthew's face went pale as he processed the implications of Joseph's news, his arms tightening protectively around Dawn as he realized that their temporary sanctuary might be about to vanish in the face of renewed government pressure to complete the mission that had cost Agent Morrison his life. "How many children?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he contemplated the scope of the tragedy that was about to unfold across the reservation. 15 families have received notices, Joseph replied, his words carrying the weight of accumulated grief for a community that had already lost too many children to government boarding schools designed to destroy every trace of tribal identity and cultural connection. The new agent says that delays caused by the Morrison incident have created a backlog that must be cleared immediately to meet federal quotas for Indian education programs. His clinical language couldn't disguise the human cost of policies that treated children as statistical units rather than as beloved family members. Miss Armstrong's expression darkened as she heard confirmation of fears that had driven her investigation from the beginning. Recognizing that Agent Morrison's death had not slowed the machinery of cultural destruction, but had merely provided an excuse for accelerating it, beyond what even Washington bureaucrats had originally intended. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice taking on the urgent tone of someone who understood that time was running out for reasonable solutions. "I need to return to the reservation immediately to observe these removal operations. If they're being conducted in violation of established procedures, I need documentation to support my report." Grace watched the exchange with growing alarm as she realized that Matthew and Dawn's case was about to become part of a much larger confrontation between federal authority and tribal resistance, a conflict that could easily escalate into the kind of violence that would destroy any chance of achieving justice through legal channels. "What about Matthew and Dawn?" she asked, her voice carrying the protective intensity of someone who had become emotionally invested in their survival. "If you leave them here while you investigate the reservation, they become sitting targets for anyone who wants to eliminate inconvenient witnesses." Captain Hayes's military training had taught him to think strategically about complex situations involving multiple hostile parties and competing objectives, but his current position required political sensitivity that went far beyond traditional military concerns about tactics and logistics. "Mrs. Morales," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone walking a diplomatic tightrope, "military protection can only extend so far without specific authorization from territorial command. If Miss Armstrong's investigation confirms violations of federal law, then we'll have legal justification for expanded protection. Until then, we're operating in a gray area that could be challenged by civilian authorities." The implications of the captain's words were clear to everyone in the room. If Crawford or his superiors decided to escalate their efforts to seize Dawn, military protection might prove insufficient to prevent another violent confrontation that could easily result in tragedy for everyone involved. Grace felt a cold fear settling in her stomach as she contemplated the possibility that all their efforts to find a peaceful solution might ultimately prove futile against the relentless pressure of corruption and greed. Matthew stood up slowly, settling Dawn against his shoulder with the careful movements of someone who had learned to function, despite bone-deep exhaustion and emotional strain that would have broken weaker men. "Miss Armstrong," he said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had made peace with the possibility of martyrdom in service of a greater cause. "If your investigation can prevent other families from suffering what mine has suffered, then it's worth the risk. But I won't let Dawn become a political symbol or a legal precedent. If staying here puts her in danger, then we'll find another way." Grace felt her heart clench at the thought of Matthew and Dawn leaving her protection to face an uncertain future alone, recognizing that somewhere during the past week she had begun to think of them not as temporary guests, but as family members whose welfare had become essential to her own sense of purpose and meaning. "Matthew," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "you're not going anywhere without me. If you run, we run together. If you fight, we fight together. That baby has already lost one mother, and I'll be damned if I let her lose the only father she's ever known." The declaration surprised everyone in the room, including Grace herself, who hadn't realized until she spoke the words how completely her life had been transformed by the arrival of a desperate father and his infant daughter. But as she looked around at the faces staring at her with various degrees of shock and admiration, she felt no regret for the commitment she had just made. Miss Armstrong was the first to break the stunned silence that followed Grace's declaration, her professional composure giving way to obvious emotion as she witnessed the kind of courage and loyalty that she had read about in reports but rarely seen displayed in person. "Mrs. Morales," she said, her voice thick with admiration and concern, "you understand that helping Mr. Bentley could cost you everything you've built here. Your business, your property, possibly your freedom if the territorial authorities decide to prosecute you for harboring a fugitive. Some things are worth more than property or freedom," Grace replied, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had discovered that protecting innocent people was more important than protecting herself. "I've spent 3 years hiding from life because I was afraid of taking risks that might cost me what little I had left. But watching this man sacrifice everything to protect his daughter has reminded me that some risks are worth taking, regardless of the consequences." Joseph Begay stepped forward with the dignity of someone who recognized courage when he saw it, his weathered hand extending toward Grace in a gesture of respect and solidarity that bridged the cultural divide between their different worlds. "Mrs. Morales," he said, his voice carrying the formal weight of someone making an official declaration, "the Navajo Nation does not forget those who stand with us in times of trial. Whatever happens in the days ahead, you will always have place among our people if you need sanctuary or support." His words were more than a personal promise. They were a guarantee backed by the collective honor of his entire community. Captain Hayes cleared his throat with the diplomatic caution of someone who understood that he was witnessing something that transcended the normal boundaries of military procedure and civilian law enforcement, recognizing that the bonds being forged in Grace's kitchen were stronger than the legal documents that defined his official authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the respectful tone of someone acknowledging extraordinary circumstances, "I believe we need to develop a comprehensive plan that addresses both the immediate security concerns and the broader questions of federal policy that this case has raised." Miss Armstrong, how quickly can you complete your investigation of the reservation situation? The sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching the trading post interrupted the captain's question, and through the window Grace could see a rider approaching at dangerous speed across the desert floor, his horse lathered with sweat and his bearing suggesting urgent news that couldn't wait for normal communication channels. The rider was one of Joseph's younger warriors, and the expression on his face as he dismounted suggested that the news he carried would change everything they had been planning. Joseph stepped outside to receive the message while the others waited in tense silence, and when he returned, his face was grim with the knowledge of developments that would force immediate decisions, rather than allowing for careful planning and deliberate preparation. "The new agent has moved faster than we anticipated," he said, his words carrying the weight of accumulated dread. "He's not waiting for individual family conferences or appeals processes. Federal marshals are conducting simultaneous raids across the reservation, taking children by force and transporting them immediately to boarding schools in distant states." The news hit the assembled group like a physical blow, transforming their careful discussions about legal procedures and investigative protocols into an urgent crisis that demanded immediate action to prevent a humanitarian disaster. Matthew's face went ashen as he contemplated the scope of what was happening to his people, while Grace felt a surge of rage at the systematic cruelty of policies designed to destroy families in the name of civilization and progress. The decision to ride toward the reservation rather than away from it came naturally to Grace as she saddled her strongest horse, while dawn painted the desert sky in shades of hope and determination, because 3 weeks of caring for Matthew and Dawn had taught her that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Captain Hayes had argued against her involvement in what he termed a dangerous reconnaissance mission, but Grace understood that this was no longer about military strategy or federal investigations. It was about standing witness to either justice or atrocity, and she refused to let bureaucratic caution prevent her from doing what her conscience demanded. Matthew rode beside her with Dawn, secured in a specially crafted carrier that allowed him to keep both hands free for his rifle, while ensuring his daughter's safety during what promised to be a perilous journey across territory where federal marshals were conducting forced removals with the systematic efficiency of a military campaign. Miss Armstrong had departed 2 hours earlier with a small cavalry escort, her mission to document federal violations, providing legal cover for what everyone understood was essentially a rescue operation disguised as an official investigation. The landscape through which they traveled told the story of a people under siege, with abandoned hogans marking places where families had fled rather than face the choice between surrendering their children or watching them taken by force. Joseph Begay rode at the head of their small column with the grim determination of a man returning to defend his homeland against an invasion that used law enforcement rather than artillery to achieve the same devastating effect on tribal communities. The boarding school in Carlisle has sent representatives, Joseph explained as they paused to rest their horses beside a natural spring that had sustained travelers for generations, before the government decided that water rights belonged to whoever could file the proper paperwork. They're offering cash bounties for each child delivered, turning federal agents into bounty hunters who profit from destroying families. His words carried the bitter understanding of someone who had watched economic incentives transform misguided policy into systematic cruelty. Grace felt her anger building as she contemplated the scope of the conspiracy that had targeted Dawn not just for her mineral inheritance, but as part of a broader campaign to eliminate tribal identity through the deliberate destruction of family bonds that had sustained the Navajo people for centuries. "How many children have they taken since Morrison's death?" she asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer to a question that would quantify the human cost of government efficiency. 47 so far, Matthew replied, his voice hollow with the grief of someone who understood that each number represented a family torn apart and a child stripped of everything that connected them to their heritage and identity. "My cousin's 2 sons, my sister's daughter, children who were learning our language and our ways, all of them loaded onto wagons like cattle being driven to market." The pain in his voice was matched by the fierce protectiveness with which he held Dawn, as if his physical closeness could shield her from the same fate. The sound of gunfire in the distance brought their conversation to an abrupt halt, the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the desert with the unmistakable signature of conflict between people who had reached the point where words could no longer resolve their differences. Captain Hayes's advance scouts had reported federal marshals operating in the area, but the intensity of the shooting suggested something more serious than routine law enforcement activities. "Resistance," Joseph said, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow as he recognized the sound of his people fighting back against impossible odds. "Some families have decided that death is preferable to separation, that it's better to die together than live apart in the white man's schools and prisons." His words painted a picture of desperation so complete that parents were willing to sacrifice everything rather than watch their children disappear into institutions designed to erase every trace of who they were. Grace spurred her horse forward with the determination of someone who had committed herself completely to this cause, recognizing that whatever was happening ahead required witnesses who could testify to the truth regardless of which side emerged victorious from the confrontation. Matthew kept pace beside her, his rifle ready, but his primary attention focused on protecting Dawn from the violence that seemed to be consuming everything around them. They crested a low ridge to see a scene that would haunt Grace's dreams for years to come, a traditional Navajo family compound surrounded by federal marshals who had taken cover behind government wagons while return fire came from the hogans, where parents and grandparents had barricaded themselves with their children, rather than surrender them to forced removal. The siege had the ugly efficiency of professional soldiers dealing with desperate civilians, But the defenders fought with the fierce courage of people protecting everything they held sacred. Miss Armstrong sat her horse beside Captain Hayes. At a safe distance from the firefight, her notebook out as she documented federal procedures that clearly violated every regulation governing the treatment of tribal families. "This is not law enforcement," she called out to the captain, her voice carrying above the sound of gunfire, with the outrage of someone witnessing the transformation of policy into atrocity. "This is military action against civilians who are defending their legal rights under federal treaty." The captain's face was grim as he watched his country's representatives conduct what amounted to warfare against families whose only crime was refusing to surrender their children to cultural extinction. Recognizing that his military oath required him to uphold the Constitution, even when civilian authorities were violating it in pursuit of their own agendas. "Sergeant Morrison," he called to his senior non-commissioned officer, "signal those marshals to cease fire immediately. This operation is being conducted without proper military authorization." Grace watched the drama unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made through individual acts of courage and conscience. But her attention was drawn to a movement in the brush that suggested someone was attempting to escape the siege through stealth rather than confrontation. A young Navajo woman carrying an infant was making her way toward the safety of the rocks, clearly hoping to avoid the violence that had already claimed too many lives. Without thinking, Grace dismounted and moved toward the fleeing woman, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons and posed no threat to someone who had every reason to fear strangers approaching during such a desperate situation. "Sister," she called out in the few words of Navajo that Joseph had taught her during their journey, "I am Grace Morales. I am friend to Joseph Begay and Matthew Bentley. I can help you reach safety." The young woman turned toward Grace with the wild eyes of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Her infant clutched against her chest with the same desperate protectiveness that Grace had seen in Matthew during his first days at the trading post. "They killed my husband," she said in broken English, her voice raw with grief and shock. "They said he was resisting arrest, but all he did was stand between them and our son. They shot him down like a dog in front of his own children." Grace felt something fundamental shift inside her as she heard the woman's testimony, recognizing that she was witnessing not just the enforcement of misguided policy, but the deliberate use of violence to terrorize families into compliance with cultural genocide disguised as education. "Give me your baby," she said, extending her arms with the calm authority of someone who had learned to inspire trust in desperate circumstances. "I'll carry him to safety while you help your other children escape." The transfer of the infant from his mother to Grace's arms carried symbolic weight that transcended the immediate practical necessity, representing the kind of trust between strangers that could only exist when people recognized their shared humanity despite the differences that governments and institutions used to justify treating them as enemies. The baby was perhaps 6 months old, his dark eyes wide with the alertness of someone who had already learned that the world was full of dangers that required constant vigilance. Matthew appeared at Grace's side with Dawn still secure in her carrier, his presence providing additional protection for the expanding group of refugees who were gathering around the one spot in this landscape of violence where safety seemed possible. "Maria," he said, recognizing the young woman despite the dirt and blood that marked her ordeal, "where are your other children? How many families are still trapped in the compound?" "6 families," Maria replied, her voice gaining strength, as she realized that rescue was possible rather than merely hopeful. "Maybe 20 children total, from babies to teenagers. The marshals said they had orders to take them all, that there would be no exceptions for age or family circumstances." Her words painted a picture of systematic removal that went far beyond what even the most aggressive boarding school policies had previously attempted. The gunfire from the compound began to slacken as Captain Hayes' intervention took effect. But Grace could see that the lull in violence was temporary rather than permanent. A brief pause that provided an opportunity for negotiation, but wouldn't last long if the fundamental disagreement couldn't be resolved. "Matthew," she said, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out for peaceful solutions. "We need to get these children away from here before the shooting starts again." It was Joseph Begay who provided the answer to their tactical dilemma, his knowledge of the local terrain suggesting a route that would allow them to evacuate the trapped families without exposing them to crossfire from either federal marshals or desperate defenders. "There's a canyon path that leads to the old ceremonial grounds," he explained, pointing toward formations that were invisible to untrained eyes, but represented sanctuary to people who understood the spiritual significance of places where their ancestors had conducted sacred rituals for generations. Grace found herself coordinating the evacuation with the calm efficiency of someone who had discovered reserves of courage and leadership she never knew she possessed, organizing the refugees into small groups that could move quickly through terrain that favored people who knew how to read the desert's moods and opportunities. Matthew took point with his rifle ready, while she and Maria carried the youngest children, and Joseph guided them along paths that had been used by his people for centuries before the government decided that ancient rites were subject to modern revision. The journey to safety took them past scenes of devastation that would reshape Grace's understanding of what her government was capable of doing in the name of civilization and progress. Burned hogans where families had chosen destruction over surrender, scattered possessions marking places where children had been torn from their parents' arms. The debris of lives destroyed by policies that treated cultural diversity as a problem to be solved through force rather than a treasure to be preserved. Dawn slept peacefully through most of the evacuation, her trust in the adults around her providing a stark contrast to the older children who had learned to fear strangers and question the motives of anyone who claimed to offer help. Grace watched Matthew interact with these traumatized youngsters with a gentleness that reminded her why she had been willing to risk everything to protect his relationship with his daughter. The ceremonial grounds provided not just physical sanctuary but spiritual restoration for people who had been pushed to the breaking point by forces beyond their control or understanding. The ancient peace of the place offering healing that no government institution could provide or replicate. As the evacuated family settled into temporary safety, Grace realized that she was witnessing the birth of something new, a community of resistance that would preserve Navajo traditions despite official efforts to eliminate them. Miss Armstrong arrived at the ceremonial grounds just as the sun reached its zenith. Her official investigation transformed into personal commitment as she documented not just federal violations but the human cost of policies that treated children as political pawns rather than individuals deserving of love and protection. "Mrs. Morales," she said, her voice thick with emotion and determination, "I'm filing my report immediately with recommendations for congressional investigation and criminal prosecution of officials who exceeded their authority, but you should know that powerful interests in Washington and Santa Fe will fight to suppress this information." Grace looked around at the families who had lost everything except their determination to remain together despite government efforts to separate them, recognizing that the real victory was not in legal proceedings or political investigations, but in the simple fact that children were sleeping safely in their parents' arms, rather than being transported to distant schools, designed to strip away their identities. "Miss Armstrong," she said, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had discovered her true purpose in life, "some fights are worth having regardless of whether you win or lose. And some families are worth protecting regardless of what it costs." The months that followed brought congressional hearings and federal reforms that curtailed the most abusive aspects of boarding school policies. But the real changes happened in places like Grace's trading post, which became an unofficial sanctuary for Navajo families seeking to preserve their cultural traditions while adapting to the changing realities of territorial life. Matthew and Dawn found permanent homes and hearts that had learned to measure wealth in terms of love shared rather than property accumulated. Years later, when Dawn had grown into a young woman who spoke both Navajo and English with equal fluency, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in the world, Grace would sit on her porch watching the desert sunset and remember the desperate man who had collapsed at her door, carrying nothing but hope. And an infant daughter. The trading post had prospered in ways that couldn't be measured in monetary terms, becoming a bridge between cultures rather than a fortress against change. The story that began with a knock at the door in the desert had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to choose love over fear, family over isolation, and justice over convenience, proving that sometimes the most important victories are won not through force or law but through the simple decision to open your heart to strangers who need sanctuary in a world that too often mistakes cruelty for strength.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.